Hi everyone, this is Dr. C. I hope you're doing well and that you're having an excellent start to your midterms. Midterms are basically starting, right? Um, Today, in a moment, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to cut over to a discussion and explanation of essay structure. This explanation is meant to, or this part of the video that I'm going to click over to in just a second, is meant to help you uh, come to a stronger sense of the real basics and rudiments of written argumentation, especially at this level, at the college and university level. Once you see that video, I think you'll understand. Some of you have emailed me asking about how you should go about structuring Essay 1, and I've appreciated those emails, and I thought maybe going through that kind of detailed breakdown of essay structure would really help. And you'll find when I go through that video, or when I click over to that part of the video, you will find that it's pretty detailed, and it's meant to help those of you who are more comfortable using thesis statements and working in sort of a traditional way of putting together your essays, as well as those of you who have found a lot of purchase and value in the enthymeme work that we've been doing over the last week and a half or so. Some of you have really caught on to that, and I think that this essay structure, I tried to set up the explanation of essay structure so that it would be of benefit to both groups, if that makes sense. I just quickly want to go through the readings that we have scheduled for Wednesdays. The syllabus promise I would address that and talk about that in this lecture. Basically, the readings from reading, reasoning, and writing are more focused on how to put your own work together. I think those are pretty valuable readings. If you have questions about the how to write section, for instance, it would be a really good idea for you to post those questions to me. Maybe post them in that forum that we've been using to communicate with one another and post questions, or just email them to me, and I can answer them for you. And if they're questions I think the entire class would have, then I would answer them in a class-wide message or announcement. But overall, I think that one's pretty clear. It's about 8 pages of what should have felt like refresher to you, given that you're in Writing 123. The revising section, which is quite shorter, it's just about a page, maybe a page and a half long, is actually the part that I think is the most difficult for most students in Writing 123, because so many of them think of revising as basically proofreading. Revising means to see again. You can't really revise something if you haven't given enough time, dedicated enough time to the writing process for you to be able to draft it, put it down, get it out of your head, and then come back to it and see it again. That's really not possible. Proofreading is entirely possible. Right after you finish working on something, you can proofread it. Proofreading actually comes from an old term, proof, which basically meant when you were engaged in the act of publication and print publication. When you got to a certain stage, you would produce the proofs, and that's pretty close to being done with something. Then you hand it to a proofreader, and that proofreader goes through it, and they do a line-by-line edit of it to make sure that you dotted all your I's, crossed all your T's, use your marks and punctuations correctly, so on and so forth. So that reader of proofs is a proofreader. Proofs are actually the sort of document or the sort of rough draft that you produce, or close to final draft that you produce when you are in the world of print publication. So if you've ever worked on a newspaper or on a magazine or something like that, then proofreading, you probably already know the history of proofreading and the term proofreading itself. But for those of you that don't, because so few people really know where that word comes from, they often confuse it with revising, which is a totally different activity. Revising is much more elemental and fundamental than proofreading is. Proofreading is just making sure that your sentences are clear. Revising is making sure that your sentences and paragraphs are saying what you really intended to say. It's quite different. So I think slowing down for a second and really thinking through how you define proofreading and revising would be a really great use of your time while you're drafting Essay 1. There are these other readings that you have for this week: the Hume piece on climate change, the significance of religion, and the Stover piece, Two Wrongs Make a Right, using pseudoscience and reasoning fallacies to complement primary literature. Keep in mind that those two readings are also available to you for those of you that are wondering where you can get that fourth source, the fourth assigned source, that the syllabus, the prompt for Essay 1 states you must include in the essay. Those two readings are available to you, so keep that in mind. Okay, right now what I'm going to do is cut on over to the part of this video that's focused on breaking down essay structure for you and helping you see how you can actually use it to make sure that your papers are as strong as possible. Okay?
Okay, so I am going to walk you through sort of the standard progression that you see in argumentative essays, and basically what I mean by that is, if you can think of, I want to use the metaphor of making clothing, like someone who's makes clothing for a living, or even as a hobby, you'll often walk into their shop and they'll have what they refer to as a dress form, which is basically like a humanoid figure that they lay the fabric over to make sure that when they make something for somebody to wear, that people can actually wear it. In other words, it's sort of the basic fundamentals of the human body underneath the clothing itself. Much like if you were to take apart a building, you would notice fairly quickly after you got all the walls and everything out of the way that there's a structure, a frame that the building is built upon. You can think of what I'm about to show you as essentially sort of a frame or standard progression of written argumentation, both in the popular realm and actually in the scholarly realm. The rules are the same, although in scholarship, in the kind of argumentative writing that you're doing, there's a much more of an emphasis placed on your argument coming out of the sources that you encounter and your ability to use those sources to support the argument that you make. So I'll start off with the introduction. Obviously, you have to have a title. Always make sure that you don't italicize, underline, or bold your title. You should never bold anything, and the only thing that should ever appear italicized or placed in quotation marks in your title should be the title of something else. If it appears in your title that needs italicizing or quotation marks. So, in the introduction, students often ask me about introductions, and they come to this class with all kinds of funky notions of how introductions can work. Basically, an introduction should introduce your problem, your topic, what's the essay about, the problem, what's at issue with the topic that the essay is about. You can think of that as being sort of the sentence version of your question at issue. Since we're working on questions at issue in this class, you can actually use those. If you sort of reverse engineer them into their sentence form in the introduction of an essay. Depends on whether you're writing your essay based on that problem, right? And then you end your introduction with your thesis statement, or if you prefer and you want to use an enthymeme, you can use an enthymeme there instead of your thesis statement. Your thesis statement is your main assertion, right? It's what the essay is about. You'll notice that there are these paragraph marks off in the left-hand side, these little P's that you see here. I'll go ahead and sort of underline this one so you see what I'm talking about. These P's with a double stem, those are paragraph marks. That just indicates when you need to move from one paragraph to the next. Now, there are these moments in essays when you have to start a new paragraph. You've got to start a new paragraph after you finish your introduction. You've got to start a new paragraph after you finish what's referred to as the context and definition section. That's this part here, and all that means is that sometimes in an essay, it makes it easier on you if you define your terms or establish context early on in the essay, so that in the body of the essay you're not constantly having to define terms or set up context. So if that context is important for the rest of the essay, set it up early. If you need to define a term that's really important for the whole essay, like SUVs, for instance, which are quite different but often hard to differentiate from passenger cars, then you want to go ahead and define your terms as early as possible. This section up here is where you would do that. Now, this context and definition section might take up one paragraph or two. Paragraphing is much more flexible than students often think. Your introduction might take up one paragraph or two. It all depends on what you're doing in the introduction and in the context/definition sections. What's very true is that you need to make sure that both of those sections take up roughly the same amount of page space. The same thing goes for your conclusion. Your conclusion and your introduction should be roughly equivalent in terms of page space. The number of paragraphs dedicated to each is flexible, but you can make sure that you have a proportional introduction and conclusion by looking at them and comparing them to one another and thinking of them in terms of the length of the essay itself. A page-long introduction, a page-long conclusion is clearly too much for an essay that is 4 pages long. But a page-long introduction, page-long conclusion might work for an essay that's 15 pages long. For a 4-page to 6-page essay, I would suggest to students they keep the introductions and conclusions to no more than about half a page to 2/3 of a page, depending on the length of the assignment. But that's sort of the rule, is that you need to think in terms of proportionality of page space more than you need to think about making sure that you dedicate one paragraph to one thing. Paragraphing is much more flexible on this level, as you've already noticed. But you do have to have, there's certain places in an essay where you have to have paragraph breaks. After the introduction, before the context and definition section. After the context and definition section, before the body. And in between each one of the reasons that you see in the body, each one of the points that you have for why your thesis statement or enthymeme is valid and true, in between each one of those reasons you must have a paragraph break. But each one of those reasons, as you can see here, by the varying number of paragraphing marks that you see dedicated to each reason, there's 2 for reason 1, 2 for reason 2, but 3 for reason 3. It doesn't really matter how many paragraphs you use to develop each one of these reasons. What matters is that you use a number of paragraphs necessary for you to increase and facilitate reader comprehension. Use paragraphing to help you be clearer in what you say and to say things more clearly and more concisely. What is really important, as you can see here, is that each one of these reasons is developed in, roughly speaking, the same amount of page space. Again, proportionality is really important, much more important than trying to use paragraphs to achieve proportionality, is paying close attention to page space, which is actually how readers gauge proportionality. So each one of these reasons, what I would suggest to you, those of you using enthymemes, is that you actually use the enthymemes that you come up with and the reasons that you come up with in your enthymemes as the reasons that you see stated here. And if you begin each one of these quote-unquote sections of the body of the essay by stating the reason that you're going to develop in that section of the essay. In other words, you can use your enthymeme and all the steps that you undertook to generate an enthymeme, or that you undertake to generate an enthymeme, where you actually have to produce the reasons and then do the reasoning. All that stuff actually can be used in the construction of an essay. For those of you not using enthymemes, this might be a little bit over the top, but I'll go ahead and slow down for a second and explain things for those of you who are using enthymemes. If you're using enthymemes and you state your reason at the beginning of the quote-unquote section of the essay where you're going to be unpacking that reason, in other words, here is where you're unpacking the first reason, right? So what you can do is, in the process of developing that reason, what you can have as your endpoint your reasoning. In other words, if your first reason is SUVs have great towing packages, but your reasoning, and I'm pulling this directly from that enthymeme video that we did, right? Your reasoning is that SUVs are convenient. Your job in this section of the essay where you're developing your first reason is actually to illustrate why having great towing packages makes them convenient. The second reason, SUVs are spacious, same thing. You would go ahead and by the end of this section, you would make sure that we understand how SUVs, being spacious, makes them convenient. And the rinse, wash, repeat for the third reason. So you can see how using an enthymeme can actually produce a much more bulletproof argument. Since the convenience is elemental to them being a great purchase, all you need to do is establish how each one of those reasons speaks to the convenience of the automobile. So I hope that makes sense. For those of you not using enthymemes, you would simply state your reasons, and through that process of making claims, providing support, synthesizing those claims and support, you would gradually just sort of work your way from your points / reasons to illustration of how those reasons prove that your thesis statement itself, your main assertion, is valid and true. Similar thing, achieved in different ways. Enthymemes make this a little bit easier, but they take a lot of work from the outset. Thesis statements are much more familiar to you, so whichever one you want to use is fine, but you can use the same model or structure regardless of whether you're writing thesis-based or enthymeme-based essays. After the body, you'll see that the body itself constitutes the bulk of the essay, right? After the body, start a new paragraph, and if you want to include or feel that you need to include counter-argumentation, that is where it goes. After the body, but before the conclusion in its own separately paragraph section. Now you might have a paragraph or two for counter-argumentation. How the number of paragraphs isn't as important as making sure that the counter-argument section is, roughly speaking, shorter or no longer than your introduction, which again, is about the same length as your conclusion, right? So those three, introduction, counter-argument, conclusion, and the context definition section, by the way, was 4. Would all be, if I were to pull them out of the essay and just compare the page space they take up, if all 4 are present, all 4 should be, roughly speaking, of equivalent page space, right? They may have different paragraph lengths, but they should have roughly equivalent page space. And then you have your conclusion, which is separately paragraphed from the counter-argument section. And conclusions are a little tricky. There's some advice in the Purdue OWL that help with conclusions. They're actually not that hard to write. It's just that some people have problems with them, so they can be tricky. I suggest the model that they see in the Purdue OWL for how to put together good, strong conclusions. And eventually, over time, they'll develop their own sort of like technique for putting together conclusions. So that's basically it for essay structure. And you should use this structure as you're revising. If you want to use it to put together essay 1, you can. But I would really like it if you try to use it to revise and rework what you do. I'm sorry, you can use it for essay 1.1. But if you want to go ahead and submit essay 1.1, let this marinate a little bit, and then come back and try to revise essay 1.2. So to revise the essay into essay 1.2. Using this structure, I think that would probably be the best idea, since there's not much. You only have maybe. I think that's probably the best idea, is if you go ahead and revise your essay using this structure to help you revise the essay. Hope that's clear.